Hello. Good evening. Sorry for the delay. My name is Deborah Schwartz, and I'm on the board of directors with the Mill Valley Historical Society. I'm in charge of the first Wednesday speaker series in the oral history program, and welcome to the Mill Valley Library. Thanks for being so patient. And thank you for your interest in our town and the history of California. I'm very excited about tonight's speaker, Mark Arax. His widely acclaimed book, The Dreamt Land, Chasing Water and Dust Across California, is a vivid, searching journey into California's capture of water and soil, an epic story of a people's defiance of nature and the wonders and ruin it has wrought. But before we begin, I'd like to say, first of all, thanks to the Mill Valley Public Library for the use of this space. The Historical Society is so very grateful that we can hold our speaker series here in the Creekside Room or upstairs in this wonderful, wonderful library. And we like to show our appreciation for the use of this room by helping the staff put the room back into order after the talk tonight. And so many of you who've been, I see so many faces that know the drill. We ask, might you, after the presentation, help us stack the chairs back on the racks and put them back in the closet. We really appreciate that. And so thanks in advance for any help. And additionally, I've got another thing to ask about the library. Who likes this library? You like it so much you'd like to share about how much you like it, because now would be a good time. You'll see in the back of the room we have these cards, and it's a survey for the Mill Valley Public Library. It's our opportunity to say what we like and what we don't like. What don't we like? I like everything. Maybe you do too, and they should hear it, because probably that information can be used in wondrous ways to get more support and expand possibilities here. A little bit about tonight's, the schedule is we're going to have Mark's going to talk anywhere between 40 minutes to an hour. And then after that, we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A, so I respectfully ask that you hold your questions for that time. And after that will be our time for community gathering, talking with the author, and helping to put the room in order. Backyard blindness. That's what it is when you grow up so deeply immersed in a place that it's hard to see beyond the daily. But then some places don't want to be seen. Fresno is a place that doesn't want to honor its history. It wants to cover it up. Mark and I and a few others here in this room, hands up if you were raised in Fresno. We learned about the Pueblo Indians, but nothing about the historic Indians our schools were named after, like Wawona and Tenaya. It was hazy skies, scalding heat, blinding tule fog, warm beer, cheap wine, muscle cars, football, and fantastic rock and roll. We weren't aware of the great changes to the land and water that had taken place before our birth. Innovation was considered good, and land development practically a birthright. As Mark says in his book, the contradiction of California was in the land, and the fix was in the water. So they fixed the water. The inconsistency of water distribution was leveled with the development of the California aqueducts and dams and levees, all designed to move rain from the north to the south. But there was a duality of morality in this massive undertaking. And we, the children of farmers and developers, and those that grew up in the valley, had only the vaguest sense of the deals being made in back rooms and empty fields. Mark says it best in his book. Behind me, the hard line of agriculture ends. In front of me, the hard line of desert begins. In between wends the concrete vein that funnels the snowmelt from one end of California to the other. Half of my life, I never stopped to wonder how much was magic and how much was plunder. As an adult, I have delved into the valley's past, the history of the Indian Wars in the mid-1800s, the Native Americans who lived on the margins of Tule Lake, a massive inland lake, whose margins moved by miles depending on the wind and rain and tide. And in doing so, have learned about the natural state of the San Joaquin Valley, and so altered by the time we were growing up as to be unimaginable. But it is Mark whose vivid storytelling and exhaustive investigation brings to life the alteration of the landscape over time, place, and space, told through the movement of water. This book is one of the most important books written about California in a generation, and hopefully a guide for future development planning. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Mark Arax.
God, Deborah, that was beautiful, man. There's no reason for me to talk. She took my best lines and everything else and added her own fine lines. We go back to the fig orchards of Fresno, where a lot of stuff went down, and we're still sworn to secrecy. So Deborah had me here tonight. I in the audience is one of my best friends growing up, Brad Masiello. So it's pretty moving to be here. How do you write a book that weighs 2.2 pounds? It takes a lot of patience, a little madness, maybe more madness than patience, and it's about water. So it has a huge capacity to put people to sleep. So how do you make this into a readable story? I dare say a literary story. Well, you throw in everything. So I'm not someone who parachuted in from New York into California. I grew up in the middle. And so you tell your own family story as part of the narrative. And then you're on the land doing this reportage, with farmers who never told their story. Some of them never wanted to tell their story. And how do you persuade them to tell their story? And then there's this historical excavation that you go back deep into history and you mine with those stories there. And you bring them all together and you hope that it's a readable, if not literary, treatment of the state. So the story begins, and you play with mystery a little bit and stuff like that. You try to stay away from the words and the stuff that the water geeks want you to delve into. This is not a book written for water geeks. I wrote it for people not even in California. I just thought, I'm going to tell this story. But there are certain things you have to give a nod to. For instance, how do you deal with the word acre feet? It's a pretty ugly word. It's got a hyphen in it. At first I tried to put it in gallons, but it's like infinite amount of gallons. So there's some acre feet in here. Then you have to explain what an acre foot is. And you can find that in there. And then you got to explain our water law, which is really this kind of crazy melding of riparian law, which comes from England, where it rains all the time, and then appropriative law, which is basically if you get there first, you could steal the water. So we've combined this in this kind of really weird way, and it explains a lot of the water wars that are going on. So the book begins, like a lot of my books begin, in my backyard. So I bought a house near the high school where Brad and I went to school, where Deborah and I went to school. And it was so close, my brother, who's the football coach there, I could hear him screaming at his players each morning. And I set about to plant my garden, my little suburban farm. So I picked out an Alberta peach tree, and I picked out an O'Henry peach tree, and then I picked out a Santa Rosa plum tree. I don't know if any of you had I mean, the Santa Rosa has a kind of sour, bitter, sweet taste in a bite that's just, you can't find a plum like that anymore. And then a Mission Fig, of course. And then I had my Washington navels and grapes and vegetables. But I had these 3 apricot trees in the backyard. And an apricot tree is pretty near and dear to my culture, the Armenian culture. The apricot, in fact, the Latin name is Prunus armenica. So it's like we could actually lay claim to the apricot. And the Armenian flute music, which is really achingly sad, comes out of a flute wood. So I planted these 3 apricot trees, and one was a Blenheim, which ripened pretty early. The middle one was one from China that was when it produced, it produced huge ones, and then there was one on the other side that produced late. So if I did it right, I would have like 8 weeks of apricots, and I make this Armenian sun jam, and so I count on a crop, as my grandfather used to say, and so in the midst of the drought, I went out on a January day into the backyard, and I looked again, and there were buds on my apricot trees. I thought, what the hell's going on? It's winter. This thing shouldn't be budding yet. It was at least 4 or 5 weeks early. What to call this new season? So I thought, okay, well, things will be all right. So I kept going out every so often, checking on them, and the buds ended up setting into those green nubs, and it was loaded. They were, I thought, man, I'm going to have a nice crop. I started counting up, which you should never do. I started counting up my mason jars. Not a good thing. You jinx everything. And a friend came who was actually my brother-in-law, who's a real farmer, and he said, you have to thin those trees out. And I said, thin the trees? It's like, and he started doing it on a couple branches, and it just bugged the heck out of me. And he's got his thumb and his other finger, and 2 out of every 3 fruit is dropping to the ground. And this is the brutal calculation of a real farmer, right? To make that one fruit grow into something that's sizable and beautiful, you're going to sacrifice the other 2. I just can't play God like that. So I thought, we'll let the tree decide. So it was mid-March. I went out again, and I did another double take. And this time, as I got closer, I could see that my trees were weightless. All the green nubs, there must have been 1,000 of them, were lying there at trunk's feet, one after the other. And, how to explain a mass shedding. And, so my mind started going, well, birds, jaybirds. We have several possums. We have raccoons who were coming after my chickens in the backyard. But all those things would be after sugar, and these things were far from sugar. And then my son, who would take batting practice back there and do a net, I thought, well, maybe he's shanked a couple balls or something, knocked him off. But that didn't make any sense. This was something that was in its entirety. So when I have a problem on my little suburban farm, I always call up a friend of mine. Brad and I went to school with him way back when. His name is Brad Gleason. And Brad farms about 10,000 acres of pistachios and almonds. And he's always indulged me over the years when I compare whatever happens in my little half-acre of ground with his 10,000 acres. And I said, hey, Brad, I don't have a single apricot left. They're all gone. And he said, Mark, I'm coming to the house. I'm going to pick you up. I need to show you my nuts. And I said, okay. I changed that line, obviously, because it has could have another meaning in the book. But Brad shows up in a truck, and we drive out past the San Joaquin River to the vast west side of Fresno, and we get to a creek called Cantua. And Cantua Creek is where Joaquin Murrieta, the legendary bandit of California, met his end. And I was always fascinated by Joaquin Murrieta as a kid. We would go to these fairs, and you'd walk into these little booths, and you'd see this head, with a swarthy mustache and eyebrows, long hair, and they would say, "That's the head of Joaquin Murrieta." I'm not sure, but it was pickled in gin. So we land in Brad. This is one of his orchards, one of his pistachio orchards, and he starts running into the orchard. He grabs a stick. I run in after him. And a pistachio orchard is a weird thing. It's kind of grooved for industrial. The branches have been pruned in a way it looks like the antlers on a buck. And there's not a weed to be found, not a burrow for not an animal, nothing. It's just that tree and that manicured dirt. And Brad takes the stick and he starts slapping these hanging pods of pollen from the males. And he's trying to see if any green dust is coming off, and no green dust is coming off. And he says, and in the pistachio orchard, for every 24 females, there's one male. And they're planted in a kind of this geometric pattern. And he said, my females have been ready for 3 weeks. My males are nowhere near. And he said, in 35 years of farming pistachios, I've never seen this kind of mismatch. And I said, well, what is it? And he kind of hemmed and he hawed and he had his boot and he was scuffing it in the ground. And he looked up and he said, well, he said 3 words that no farmer in the valley says, or not many of them, out loud. It's global climate change. So there was a connection between my pistachios and my apricots and his pistachios. And I remember something my grandfather told me. He was he came here as a poet from Constantinople. He was Armenian, and he said our apricot tree, because he claimed that it was our apricot trees are very tuned to nature. They have to know the kiss of death in winter to be able to produce fruit, to hold on to the fruit in spring. So we didn't have enough chilling hours in these winters to put the tree fully to sleep. And that's what accounted for the mass shedding of my apricots. And that's what was accounting for the mismatch in Brad's orchard. So Brad had a solution that I didn't have. And we were talking, and all of a sudden I heard this whining sound, and I looked, and screaming up and down his orchard rows were these 3 guys riding these three-wheelers. And on the back of each 3-wheeler was a gardener's blower. And they were blowing harvested male pollen into the waiting limbs of these trees, the females. And Brad, I remember saying, I thought this was funny too. A lot of sexual innuendos. He said, I'll know in 3 weeks if the females are keen. So I guess the females were keen because he had a really good crop that year. Pistachios have their alternate bearers, 1 year heavy, 1 year light. So Brad was able to get a crop. And then we went a little bit beyond that field where Brad was drilling into the ground a hole 2,000 feet deep. And he was trying to extract water out of this ancient aquifer. And the water was flowing out of a pipe, and I remember he put his 2 hands in and he drank it. He said, drink some. It was really salty. But pistachios can handle salt. And so I said, well, what are you doing? I mean, this thing looked like a rig out of Texas. And Brad had this kind of crazy look in his eyes. And he said, well, there's water down there. And I thought, man, this is just mining. This goes back to our birth, California's birth. So the first 4 chapters of this book, I'm on the land, first 5 chapters in present day, seeing this kind of madness play out. Even my good buddy who is not one of these farmers who doesn't see the consequences of his agriculture. He does. And he's fighting all the time the Westlands Water District, which he's a part of, which is kind of a behemoth that ends up being involved in so many of these water wars. But, you know, he's trying to survive. There's no water coming down the Central Valley Project or the State Water Project in those years. And so he's doing the best he can. But as he and thousands of others are drilling these holes deep into the ground, the earth is sinking. In chapter, I think it's 3 or 4, it's called Sinking. There's a famous photo in there of a USGS scientist named Joe Poland standing next to a telephone pole. How many of you have ever seen this photo? It gets passed around every drought. And Joe Poland, I found out, was a very sedate kind of scientist who had been documenting the sinking of the ground in the San Joaquin Valley for almost a half century. And no one was paying attention because the sinking was almost like termites eating at the foundation of your house. It was so incremental, so small that you didn't notice. Okay, so he wanted to make everybody notice. And I thought he was probably inspired by Ripley's Believe It or Not, which was that old strip that used to run in newspapers of these freaky kinds of things. So he decides he's going to turn subsidence into a drama. So he finds a telephone pole on the west side, and he puts 3 dates up. The first date is 40 years ago, the middle date is 20, and then the date down below is 1977. And that is an illustration, that long, long wooden pole, of how much the earth has fallen in the San Joaquin Valley in those years. And the problem is as the earth is sinking, the infrastructure is sinking. So we have this, the California Aqueduct. It runs 444 miles, our concrete river. It's the thing that delivers our flow from north, the Delta, to the south. Actually, it's connecting Mount Shasta all the way to San Diego, if the truth be known. And as the groundwater beneath that land is being taken out, the land is sinking, and the aqueduct itself is sinking. The aqueduct, when you get up close, you see that it's not just one continuous concrete river. It's a series of pools that have been connected. And so in this section of ground was the aqueduct sinking, and I found Joe Poland's successor, a woman named Michelle Sneed, who is now documenting a new generation of sinking. And she took me along the aqueduct. I could see where it was crumbling from the sinking. And basically 4 complete pools had stagnated. That aqueduct, like many of the canals that run north to south, depends on gravity for its flow. It would be far too expensive to use electricity to do it. So we now had lost the gravity flow in those pools, and we were having to spend millions of dollars a year, tens of millions of dollars a year, to push that water through the dead spots. So this is what I'm documenting in the first several chapters, and at some point you could say it's a literary device, an artifice, whatever. It occurs to me that, okay, this kind of madness that I'm seeing playing out in real time, it has a history. It has some seeds. Where does that begin? Where does the extraction model of California begin? I had an argument with my editor back in New York. He wanted me to start the story of the history of California with the gold rush, which is a logical place to start because the mining of water, the mining of gold is really the mining of water first. But I thought, no, there's a prehistory to California, a pre-settlement history that needs to be looked at. Because if you look at all our resources that we've taken and bent and manipulated, really it's the body of the indigenous, the body of the Indian that's the first taking of a resource in California. We had the largest concentration of indigenous of any place in North America. There were 300,000 natives. They weren't like the natives of the Midwest. They're not the Cherokee, not the Seminole, not the Sioux, all those tribes that we grew up with that were warring over resources. In California, there were plenty of resources, so the tribes got along. Up comes Father Sarah, the missions begin, and we see the taking of the body of the Indian, and it's through that taking that we end up taking the first rivers, building the first dams. Then John Sutter arrives. And Sutter's a beauty. He's come here, like so many of the early folks, to reinvent himself. He's a fugitive from justice in Switzerland. He leaves behind his wife, 4 children. He arrives, he reinvents himself. He's a military man, a military hero all of a sudden. He comes to California when it's under the control of Mexico. He goes to Monterey. He sees the governor, I think it was Governor Alvarado. And Alvarado thinks, okay, here comes another white guy who wants to, like the Russians, take some coastal land. But no, Sutter tells him that his interest is in the interior. He wants to go into the land of the Tules. And so Alvarado thinks, man, this guy's a little crazy, but maybe he can help us tame the last of the Indians. So he heads into the interior, and where does he set up his new settlement, what he's going to call New Helvetia? He sets it up at the confluence of the American and Sacramento rivers, the worst floodplain in all of California. So there's our original sin, this notion that we can settle right where nature, is, right in the path of nature. So I follow Sutter through the gold rush, and the gold rush, as we all know, supercharges California in a way that no society has ever had that kind of start. Overnight, we become this place, and overnight we're mining gold. And we take those rivers, we put them into flumes, and then we figure out if we want more erosive power, we're going to take the water in those flumes and we're going to put them in canvas hoses. And then we figure out that if you put a nozzle at the end of that canvas hose, you're no longer placer mining, you're actually hydraulic mining. And so this is what happens. The melting of the mountains happen, the sediment comes down those rivers, they pollute the early agriculture that's in the alluvial plains. And California now in the 1880s has a choice. Are we going to mine gold or mine the soil? The farmers rise up, they bring a case, it's the first environmental case in the West, and a judge very hesitantly decides, apologizing all the way along the way in his decision, that the industry of one cannot pollute the industry of another. And so in the 1880s, California decides that the gold mines are going to basically shutter, and we're going to start mining the soil. What you see is that very industrialists who made the most money on gold, who were living on Nob Hill in San Francisco, they then tried to industrialize agriculture. So the wheat king in the 1880s is a guy named Isaac Friedlander. Isaac Friedlander is a giant of a man, giant imagination, giant brain power. He's physically a giant, 6'7", 300 pounds. They say his stride is twice the stride of a normal man's. And he starts planting the interior of California in wheat. There are millions of acres of wheat. He's joined with a Dr. Glenn County, and we become, the middle of California becomes the greatest supplier of wheat to the world. And Friedlander has this so dialed in that he not only has the workforce, the labor, the machines, but he's got clipper ships that end up delivering this wheat all the way to Liverpool, where Europe goes crazy over California wheat. I think they called it California velvet or white velvet. When you look at the production of wheat, you see that it was at this high point, and then it precipitously starts to drop. And what we learn is that monoculture, that planting of a single crop, is robbing the fertility of the soil. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, California has a second choice. And that choice is, what do we farm? And so we turn from wheat, the monoculture of wheat, to what we have essentially today, which is the, this varied agriculture of vegetables, fruits, and nuts. This is when my grandfather arrives. It's a very key time in the development of California. My grandfather, in 1915, he's 15 years old. The Turks are rounding up Armenian males in Constantinople. They want to send them to the interior to massacre them like they're doing with the rest of the Armenians. My grandfather basically hides in an attic. and he takes up 3 books of French literature because he wants to be a poet, and he hides up there for a couple of years. When he comes down after the fever of genocide has passed, he wanders out into the world that's changed so much. He finds a bookstore, the last remaining Armenian bookstore, and he goes to work there, and these surviving Armenian writers take him under their wings, and they start squiring him about, being a poet. The first thing these guys do, they all have massive egos, is they give each other pen names. And so my grandfather is named Johnny Hosepian. The IAN on the end of an Armenian name means son of. So somewhere along the way, we were the son of Joseph. The Armenians, the Turks had a funny way of identifying people. There was like Topal in Armenian means crippled. So Topalian is the son of the crippled. Voskovich is gold. So Voskovichin is the son of someone who was a jeweler. Medzvor means big behind. So if your name is Medzvorian, it means you're the son of someone who had a very big behind. So Grandpa comes down, they give him the name Aram Aslan. Well, Aslan means lion. My grandfather's about 5'4", 120 pounds. It doesn't fit, but he's got a real way with words. They flow. And so they say, you're going to be Aram Arax. Arax is the mother river that comes down from Mount Ararat. So we're named after a river. So somehow this book was destined a century ago. So he's ready to go to the Sorbonne. There's a wealthy Armenian who loves his poetry. He's going to send him there. And then these letters begin to arrive from Fresno, California. And they're letters that the last remaining patriarch in our family is writing in. He lost everybody and has gone to Fresno to reinvent himself. And he starts writing it like, these letters didn't survive. My grandfather, just before senility, passed on the contents to me. He remembered them. And this was the selling of the myth of California, because by this time, the Washington Naval had taken root in Southern California, and it was selling LA to the world. LA, trainloads of people, sick, consumptives, people who were pallid, people who had conjunctivitis, they were all coming west to get healed in the sanitariums of the San Gabriel Valley, and also then to maybe buy an orchard or so of Washington Navals. So this uncle is writing him, and he says, you must come to this place at the foot of the Sierra. We are creating a new Armenia here. The grapes aren't the mere grapes of Ararat. These are grapes that hang from the vine like giant jade eggs. And the watermelons are so capacious that when you scoop out the meat with your hands, you can then ride in the shells down the rivers and irrigation canals. Yeah. So, the way Pop tells it, we had a choice, Paris, France, or Fresno, California. And he took the bait, got here. He described his uncle. He said he picked me up at the Fresno depot. His hair was gleaming. He had a full suit on. His shoes were polished, and I couldn't tell what was polished more, the Model T Ford or his shoes. And he said, we got into this Model T Ford, and I've never heard a sound like this in my life. Toka, 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 toka. And he said he drove me to the San Joaquin River, and I couldn't believe my eyes. They were blowing up the land. And I said, what do you mean? He said, they were planting the biggest garden of figs the world had ever seen. Fig garden where we grew up. And the ground was such hardpan, this red kind of hardpan, that they had to stick, for each tree, they had to put a stick of dynamite in a hole to blow it up. So the land was literally exploding. This was the reinvention that was beginning. And by the time it was done, the San Joaquin Valley was the most altered landscape in human history. And we created something. And that became a kind of ethic that grew, and we already had a model. Once we needed water, we already had a model in LA. So our first water becomes the river water, and we start farming the alluvial plain, the best soil. Then in 1920, the year my grandfather arrives, the turbine pump is invented. And this allows you to go into the aquifer, to go beyond the river's flow. So then you see agriculture, the footprint of agriculture, extend from that prime alluvial ground to ground that was more marginal. And that footprint goes out. Today, and this is the paradox of technology, the unintended consequences, you see now with drip irrigation, an expansion of the footprint of agriculture on the land that's not mediocre, but that is downright poor, that doesn't even, that shouldn't even be farmed. And here's why. Drip can move uphill. So now you can plant your orchards up a hill. Drip can move onto rocky ground, junky ground, alkali-laden ground, because it delivers a precise dose of water and fertilizer and chemical to a root zone. So the ground, the soil, is not even relevant anymore. It's just there to stand up the tree, basically. You might as well be hydroponically farming. So we've seen now a massive expansion of the farm belt because of drip irrigation, which was supposed to save water. And that footprint has gone out, and this is what we're confronting today. So at some point, those early farmers in the 20s run into a drought that was almost as bad as the last drought we had. They can't pump any more out of the ground. The land starts sinking. The rivers, the snow melt, it's been apportioned 5 times over. And they say, we need to do what LA did. We need to go afar and steal us a river. And this is when the farmers of the San Joaquin Valley start selling the Central Valley Project to California in a time of depression, that they're going to go up and take the excess flows of the Sacramento River and ship them down. And then the flows of the San Joaquin River will go to Bakersfield, 160 miles south. So basically they took the San Joaquin River, our river, stopped it in a canyon, boxed it up, and shipped it 160 miles south, and then in a kind of blood transfusion to replenish what was in the San Joaquin River, they brought in Sacramento River water, and no one in Sacramento at the time complained. First of all, there was really no environmental movement. There was no movement on behalf of the fish. And Sacramentans felt, well, okay, we're going to get some flood control out of this. So California sees, we're going to solve a dust bowling of California in the middle and flooding in the north, and everything's going to be fine. Well, it wasn't, because the farmer, the more water he got, the more water he needed to get. And so now, today, as the book moves from the building of the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project, the Central Valley Project is built in drought. The State Water Project comes out of the flood of the mid-1950s. The system's in place. Now we're seeing these water wars begin. That's where we're at today. And then the last third of the book is present day. And that present day starts with me on the land. I call it the kingdom of wonderful. Stuart Resnick had never told this story before. He's a kid who came out of New Jersey, came west to go to UCLA. By the time he was at UCLA Law School, he was a millionaire. His father basically ran a bar in New Jersey, and it's the one thing we had in common. My dad had a bar too. And he ends up leveraging things. First it's cleaning buildings, and then it's giving security alarms to buildings, and then it's having telefloral that comes up, and then it's the Franklin Mint, where you can get all the Princess Di dolls and the Elvis plates and all those kinds of things. And each thing ends up leveraging into something else, and he buys all this farmland, and now he's the biggest farmer in the world, the biggest grower of pistachios, almonds, pomegranates, and mandarins. Those little cuties. But he had a partner in the cuties, and he and the partner went to war. The partner bought out the cutie brand, the brand that his wife Linda, who's an expert in branding things, came up with. And so they sold that brand, and then she invented the Halo brand. So right now in the San Joaquin Valley, we have a war going on between the Halos and the Cuties. So this is the complexity of what we've done here, and I visit each place trying to understand its extraction, its taking. When the system was built, we had 11, 12, 13 million Californians. Today we have 40 million. And the system is cracking. And it's not going to see us into a future of more almonds and more houses. One of those things is going to have to give. I don't know what you're betting on. But the way I see history is that the houses are going to win. And that valley, which has so many problems, and I delve into all of them, the bending of farm labor, the bending of chemical, the bending of bees, this manipulation, this plantation society, but there's some beauty to it. There's some, the valley isn't one place, it's 3, 4 places. The east side, Citrus Belt, that's a place that's sustainable. Exeter had more millionaires per capita than any place in the country. You could be a millionaire with 60 acres of oranges. The middle valley where the water pools and you can draw it up from 40 to 50 feet deep, that land is very sustainable. And there are towns like Fowler, Selma, Kingsburg, where Armenian, Italian, Volga German, Swedes, Japanese farmers still farm that ground. Then you go to the west side where Brad's land was, where you have to go 1,000, 2,000 feet deep to get the water. There, the farmer doesn't live in the land. When Brad and Deborah and I went to school at Bullard High School, we went to school with a lot of kids who had they were farmers. When they were born, they were deeded 960 acres of land, out in Westland's water district. Because with that deed, with that land came federal water. So they didn't live on their farms in the west side. They lived in the 937 or 93705. Yeah. And they farmed from afar, and that their relationship was distant from the land. So when you go out to the west side today, you will find the most impoverished communities in the state. Huron, Mendota, Fireball. And I posit the reason that is because the farmer, the land is a utility to him. It's no longer something personal. It's distant. It's only 60 miles distant, but that's enough distance to have a kind of psychological exile from the ground. And so that poverty is not yours. It's not on you psychologically. So the valley is all these different places, and as I was driving up here today along 5, I was passing Patterson, which was the apricot capital of the world. And they're growing these grotesque subdivisions right there along 5. And the reason is that people could just hop up, cross the Altamont Pad, and they're going to get to their job in the Silicon Valley. We're going to become a bedroom community for those employment centers. And that's no way to grow a place. So what is the future we're looking at here? And this is what I want to open up. I'm going to open up for a good 20 minutes of questions. But let me set it up and frame it this way, our question session. How big can we get? Okay, we're not asking that question. And some of that, that question is kind of maybe the question that comes out of someone's mouth who's privileged. You can't grow anymore. But really, when you look at what's happening now, Governor Newsom wants to build 3 million new houses. That's a laudable goal, but into what safe zone are we going to put them? After I finished this book, I immediately went up to Paradise, that place that was nearly wiped off the California map. I wanted to understand the forces that brought that fire to be what it was, the tragedy, almost like an autopsy in a way. And I found these four moving parts, but the most important part was that the land use there had been left to the locals to decide. And the land use got corrupted by the friends of the folks on the town council and the Butte County supervisors. So that on this geologic, here you have a canyon carved out by one river, a canyon carved out by another river. You're taking the road from Chico up to Paradise. It's called the Skyway. And you're riding up this geologic ledge, which is basically a geologic chimney. And onto this chimney, they had planted the community of Paradise, which is kind of an exurb of Chico. And then at some point, Paradise creates its own sprawl further up, Magalia, so that 40,000 people are living in the path of wildfire. And if you look at California as a whole, we have, and I know this is a sensitive subject up here. I was up at Deborah's place, it's gorgeous, but it's woodlands. And there's danger. So when you have a fourth of your population, 10 million people living in the wildland-urban interface, when is that going to give? We don't need climate change in California to have climate change. It's part of our natural state. I mean, when you look at the average snowmelt rainfall, it never runs like this. It's like this. The average in California is an aberration. So this. Now you're hitching on to that volatile California climate change weather, global climate change. And we're going to see these havocs that we've never seen before. And maybe we're seeing them there now. Maybe 2018 was an episode of that. So where do we rein it in? And this is a conversation we need to be having. And so I'll go into places where liberals and conservatives kind of get nervous about talking about controlling growth. But it took us 165 years to regulate groundwater. We now have this thing called SGMA, where we're going to start regulating groundwater. And I know some of this is distant to you guys. You guys are lucky. You're one of the 5, 8, 12 places on the California map that you have your own watershed. You don't depend on the flow of a system. You have water. And I don't know how you guys came through the drought. It seems like you came through pretty good. But you're unique. The rest of us are living in this precarious situation with the water. And at some point it's going to have to dictate another way of growing the state. So that's what we're kind of confronted with. I'd like to read you just one little thing. There's a line or two might be familiar, but I want to read you something just to give you a sense of the language, and then we'll open it up to questions. Okay. Whose book is this I'm borrowing? Oh, thank you. On a summer day in the San Joaquin Valley, 101 in the shade, I emerge onto Highway 99 past downtown Fresno and steer through the vibrations of heat. I'm headed to the valley's deep south, to a little farm worker town in a far corner of Kern County called Lost Hills. This is where the biggest farmer in America, the one whose mad plantings of almonds and pistachios have triggered California's nut rush, keeps on growing, no matter drought or flood. He doesn't live in Lost Hills. He lives in Beverly Hills. How has he managed to outwit nature for so long? The GPS tells me to take Interstate 5, the fastest route through the belly of the state, but I'm partial to Highway 99, the old road that brought the Okies and Mexicans to the fields and deposited a twang on my Armenian tongue. 99 runs 2 lanes here, 3 lanes there, through miles of agriculture broken every 20 minutes by fast food, gas station, and cheap motel. tracts of houses, California's last affordable dream, civilized 3 or 4 exits, and then it's back to the open road, splattered with the guts and feathers of chickens that jumped ship on the slaughterhouse drive. Pink and white oleanders divide the highway, and every third vehicle that whooshes by is a big rig. More often than not, it is hauling away some piece of the valley's unbroken bounty. The harvest begins in January with one type of mandarin and ends in December with another type of mandarin, and in between comes everything in your supermarket produce and dairy aisles except for bananas and mangoes, though the farmers here are working on the tropical too. I stick to the left lane and stay ahead of the pack. The big rig drivers are cranky 2 ways. I'll let you figure that one out. And the farm workers in their last leg vans are half asleep. 99 is the deadliest highway in America. Deadly in the rush of harvest, deadly in the quiet of fog, deadly in the blur of Saturday nights when the field work is done and the beer drinking becomes a second humiliation. 20 miles outside Fresno, I cross the Kings, the river that irrigates more farmland than any other river here. The Kings is bone dry as usual. To find its flow, I'd have to go looking in 1,000 irrigation ditches in the fields beyond. There's a mountain range to my left and a mountain range to my right, and in between a plain flatter than Kansas where crop and sky meet. One of the most dramatic alterations of the Earth's surface in human history took place here. The hillocks that existed back in Yokut Indian days were flattened by a hunk of metal called the Fresno Scraper. Every river busting out of the Sierra was bent sideways, if not backward, by a bulwark of ditches, levees, canals, and dams. The farmer corralled the snowmelt and erased the valley, its desert and marsh. He leveled its hog wallows, denuded its salt brush, and killed the last of its Mustang antelope and Tule elk. He emptied the sky of tens of millions of geese and drained the 800 square miles of Tulare Lake dry. He did this first in the name of wheat, then beef, milk, raisins, cotton, and nuts. Once he finished grabbing the flow of the 5 rivers that ran across the plain, he used his turbine pumps to seize the water beneath the ground. As he bled the aquifer dry, he called on the government to bring him an even mightier river from afar. Down the great aqueduct, by freight of politics and gravity, came the excess waters of the Sacramento River. The farmer commanded the distant flow. The more water he took, the more crops he planted. And the more crops he planted, the more water he needed to plant more crops, and on and on. 1 million acres of the valley floor, greater than the size of Rhode Island, are now covered in almond trees. I pity the outsider trying to make sense of it. My grandfather, a survivor of the Armenian genocide, traveled 7,000 miles by ship and train in 1920 to find out of his uncle's exhortation. The grapes here are the size of jade eggs was true. My father, born in a vineyard outside Fresno, was a raisin grower before he became a bar owner. I grew up in the suburbs where our playgrounds were named after the pioneers of fruit, and irrigation canals shot through our neighborhoods to farms we did not know. For half my life, I never stopped to wonder how much was magic, how much was plunder. Thank you. Yes.
So I've read a lot about trying to, I guess this is a two-pronged question. First, there's talk about trying to put water back into the aquifer. And I don't know yet how achievable that is. The second part of the question is, we have 3 tunnels that have been ground authorized that will take water from the delta. And these 3 tubes are the size, each one the size of Greyhound buses, and ship water south, which is going to move the brackish water line so far up the delta, it's going to completely alter it.
You're talking about it's going to alter that X2 zone, and they call it in the delta.
And
Salt.
so from being an avid fly fisherman and loving the outdoors, all these things are.
Yeah, they're just more of the same stuff.
But does is there any weight to the fact that we possibly can refill the aquifer?
Yeah. So if this sigma goes into effect the way it was intended, and farming has to be sustainable, in other words, you have to be able, on an average of 10 years, to put back in the same amount of water you extract. What that's going to mean, and I document this by looking at the footprint and then also talking to the farmers and irrigation managers on the ground. It's going to mean that 6 million acres of farmland in the San Joaquin Valley alone, it's going to go, that 6 million acres will go down to 4.5 million acres. We extended agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley 1.5 million acres beyond sustainability. Nowhere worse than in Kern County, Bakersfield area. So that's one thing. Groundwater recharge, there are these water banks. The Kern Water Bank is one. My friend Brad, out in that area where Cantua Creek comes out of the Coast Range, it's a flash flood creek. There's this alluvial, porous ground that if you, in flood years, you can move water onto that ground. It'll be absorbed into the ground, and it's got this membrane down below that doesn't allow that water to migrate out. So you actually can create an underground water bank there. Brad has the evidence that he can, he's got hydrologists and geologists saying that he could store 1 million acre feet in there. And that is the way to go, as opposed to upstream dam building. It's a smarter way. Now, it can be manipulated. The water then can be sold to cities. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that could happen, but that is I think, a reasonable solution to trying to get to sustainability. My fear is that they will use that just to grow even more. So I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal. It's the first time I've ever written for the Wall Street Journal, for an essay for their op-ed page a few weeks ago. And this was before this last bout of fires. And I went back to the land of Resnick. And at the end of the drought, even Resnick had to make a concession to the drought. He had to pull out 10,000 acres of almonds and pomegranates. Didn't have enough water, even though he was doing this elaborate scheme through a pipeline with another billionaire, which becomes kind of a drama point in the book. I went back on that land, just 2 years out of drought, facing Sigma. And they had planted all those acres again and then some, mostly pistachios. So then I looked at 3 counties, Fresno, Kern, and Tulare, the 3 biggest ag counties in America. And in the last 2 years, they had planted 132,000 acres of permanent crops, new crops, pistachios, almonds, and mandarins, right there in the face of drought. The lesson of drought was the lesson that I found in the 20s, 30s, was to plant more. Then I drove up and over the mountain into Santa Clarita. And there, these earth movers were flattening the first phase of the Newhall Ranch project, the biggest master plan community in California history. 22,000 houses, 7, 8 schools. I think at this point only 1 golf course. And you look there in 2017, I think it was the Rye Fire, hopped over Interstate 5 and scorched the very ground that they were leveling for these new houses. So the piece became this kind of defiance, which is beautiful in one way. I mean, we're like, thumbing our nose and stuff, and this is our culture, and we conquer, but in another way is so destructive and so stupid. So, a long answer. Thank you. Go.
Can you talk a little bit about the choice of crops? It seems to me that when you plant trees and you go through a drought, you don't have a choice. You got to water your trees because it takes years to get them to the point where they're actually producing. You're not going to give up those years and start over.
That's right. There's $25,000 of investment. So he says he's asking about the choice of crops, and so it's a complicated. The answer to that is complicated. I'm not sure we want the state of California dictating the actual crops that a farmer should grow, but maybe that's something that we should think about. The market, you can't blame the farmer now for being gung-ho on nuts. I mean, they're selling all over the world, they're selling at great prices. Okay. The nut too is mechanized. You don't need a lot of farm labor to take that crop off the orchard. So, but it hardens water demand. If you were planting, let's say, cotton, and you had a drought year, you may idle that cotton ground, right? You have some flexibility. You don't when you have a permanent crop. So what I'm hoping is Westlands right now is 500,000 acres. It should actually be, to be sustainable, it should be 250,000 acres. They should idle that other 250,000 and then use that water on their permanent crops. That way, it makes more sense. You've idled some ground, you're saving water. And so I think that's the way at it. But you're right, there's a hardening of the water demand and a lack of flexibility. Yes.
My understanding was that most of the water policy is state mandated, but you said federal.
No, well, no. Remember, we have two systems that act as one, basically. We have the federal Central Valley Project, and the Bureau of Reclamation makes the big decisions on that. When to release flows from the dams. The feds make a decision on the pumps in the delta, the farmers' pumps. Do we turn them on and harm the fish, or do we turn them off and protect the delta? That's a federal decision. Are you going like this? You mean money? Yeah, that's it. When I started this book, I thought that the federal pumps were a danger to the fish because they drew the fish into them and they were like Cuisinarts chopping up the fish. And no, that's not true. What it is those pumps, federal and state, for this federal project and state project, are on the southern end of the delta. And they change the flow of the delta and they bring in salt a little bit into the interior. And then these fish, the smelt and the salmon, as they're searching for turbid water to hide from, they end up migrating to the southern end of the delta where the pumps are, where the flow is going. And it's there where these predatory fish, bass and birds and others, are feeding on them. So that's how they're dying. It's the altered flow. Yes?
I actually read your book, all 500 and how many pages it was.
Sounds like a...
It was worth it. It was, absolutely.
Okay. He says it's worth it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very interesting. You give a list of suggestions.
Oh, yeah.
One of them is
The dairy?
osmosis.
Oh,
Reverse osmosis. You want to create fresh water.
Oh, you're talking about the desal stuff.
Desal, yeah.
Yeah, that was really reluctant. So,
Yeah, I mean, that's expensive.
oh God, it is, yeah.
How do you propose to pay for that?
So, here's the context. At the end of this book, I'm coming from Mount Shasta, a chapter called The Holy Land. I find throughout the book, I'm teasing this last ranch we had. It was sold before I grew up on the north side of the San Joaquin River. And I go back there to find these pomegranates that my dad and uncle and grandpa would talk about. This whole long row of pomegranates that led to our old ranch. And I find pomegranate, it's a subdivision now, which my grandmother never forgave my grandfather for. You know, they sold it before it became a subdivision. And I find Pomegranate Circle, and Pomegranate Drive, and Pomegranate Lane, but no pomegranate. But out there, what was your question again? It was oh yeah. So out there, I meet this man called the Oracle, and the Oracle's a farmer who doesn't want his name used, and he's really brilliant. And he sizes up this problem in such a way talking about the overreach of agriculture on the bad ground and how easy money, too much capital in America, hedge funds and investment funds have come in and allowed this over-purchasing of ground and planting of a crop for maybe 10 years. And the Canadian Royal Mounties, their pension fund, is buying huge swaths of farmland in the San Joaquin Valley. 10,000 acres in a place called Maricopa alone in Kern County. For $480 million they bought this ground for. That's $48,000 an acre. Obscene. And they may get a decade of profit out of it. That's what they're looking at. So the Oracle is talking about all this, and he says, listen, on the way back, he says, let's solve this problem right now. I said, how? He goes, pull out your pen. So we come up with these 10 things. Because you can't write a book like this and not offer up something. So one is Sigma, the regulation of groundwater. 2, doing a better job of managing our forests. So we're taking out all that bad fuel, the growth, taking it out, clearing the way to create more snowpack, places where snowpack can sit, better watersheds up in the forest, or forest guy back there, yep. And then the sending of mega dairies to a place that truly makes cows happy. Okay, our land and water is too valuable, and I know I'm going to upset, and I do, these Azorean Portuguese and Dutch dairy farmers. I upset them, but California land and water is too valuable to have these mega dairies. They're polluting the groundwater anyhow, and to sustain them, we're growing vast amounts of silage, corn, and alfalfa, which is the biggest water guzzler around. Everybody was drought shaming the almonds, saying, man, for every nut it takes a gallon. Well, if you start looking at legumes, God forbid looking at cattle, cows, beef, yes, growing food takes a lot of water. But alfalfa probably isn't the crop you want to be growing in California, so we need to idle that. And then we get to desal. Desal is very expensive, but it may be someday when global climate changes happen and the snowpack isn't setting like it used to, that we're going to have to plant some desal along the coast. It's going to be expensive water. It's got environmental problems in getting that water, but it may free up the coastal demand. So,
I had a follow-up question. You didn't talk about tertiary treatment.
Tertiary treatment, I did talk about a little bit in the book. That's
Not
really
in that section.
not in that section. It's really being done in LA and other places. They're doing a great job of taking, doing treatment and creating more water that way. You're right. And I don't know that we're ever going to get used to, turning sewer water into drinking water. That might be a tough one, but we may get there. If California doesn't want to manage its growth and we're suddenly 60 million people, maybe these are the choices they're going to have to make. Yes?
So you read a lot about the Westlands Water District. And I have a sense that the Westland Water District is basically a device for getting very low-cost water, highly subsidized water, and then not using it for the intended purpose, but reselling it instead to the communities that are farther down the line. And that's how they actually generate huge amounts of money. And I think that they're just about to sign a contract which will guarantee their water rights into perpetuity.
Yeah, they're trying to do that. Westlands isn't doing a lot of selling of its own water to other places. It's on the open market buying water a lot. And one of the things that's happening is the Boswell Cotton Empire, which was the subject of a book I wrote with a friend of mine, Rick Wertzman, called The King of California. The Boswell Empire is now digging holes 2,500 feet in the ground, extracting water, but not using it on their crops. They're then selling that water to Westlands to grow. So Westlands is actually a buyer of water. And that is really a dangerous thing they're doing. And what's happening is the levees that protect Corcoran and other cities from floods down in the Tulare Lake Basin where Boswell's headquartered, those levees are sinking. And the people, the prison, Corcoran, they're paying $10 million to shore up those levees. So that's what's happening. A couple more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So speaking of aquifers and the emptying, years back, they discovered a huge aquifer under Nevada, and somebody bought all that stuff up. But I'm just, with this crazy growth in California and other places with these aquifers sinking, it doesn't seem like filling them up is really going to be feasible. I know it was touched on before.
Yeah, it's feasible if you've made the footprint smaller, if you've managed sprawl a little bit. You know, this is what we have to face. Housing is higher in California. Where places of demand, places that people want to live in, places of quality, the housing is higher. That's why the housing here is the way it is. That's why the housing along the coast is the way it is. It's a function of supply and demand. We have to be all right with that. You know, we keep saying California has the most cities with the highest. Well, that's because California is a place of demand. People want to live here, so it is going to be higher. This idea that we can bring those costs down by continuing to sprawl on the fringe of town is dangerous. Let me do this one thing. I was up in Portland. Portland is an interesting city. Yes, it's got its homeless. Yeah, it's got these wars between the right and the left playing out, but it's really a very vital place. And people live in Portland. They don't say they live in Portland. They say they live in the neighborhood of Portland, whatever neighborhood that is. And these neighborhoods constantly are getting reinvented. And the reason why is years ago, Portland made a decision that they weren't going to put suburbia onto their farmland. They were going to draw a ring around the city. And so what that meant is that whenever capital was available for development, went not to the fringe where it's the cheapest to grow. I mean, let's face it, the developer loves farmland because it's easy, flat, everything else. That money had to come back into the core to reinvent the core. And so these neighborhoods of Portland have been reinvented 5 and 6 times, and they're vibrant and they're hip, and people are outside, but they're expensive. Yes, they are. Where I come from, we keep allowing the fringe to grow, and what happens is a kind of cannibalization. The core of the town is hollowed out. So in Fresno, we really have a physical kind of crater in the middle of town where the most impoverished communities, one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in America are. Number 1, in front of New Orleans. And it's just a robbing that keeps going on. And now it was to the river, and now they're going across the San Joaquin River into Madera, and they're going to grow tens of thousands of more houses on an aquifer that's pretty marginal. So this is the kind of stuff that I hope this book raises, the kind of challenge and questions. It's lovely to be here tonight. I did something up at Book Passage, so this is my second time in the neighborhood. And Deborah's been a wonderful host, introduced me to some really wonderful people today. I saw some great old friends, so it couldn't be better. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for